So everybody's spoken about why The Force Awakens is good or bad, and this is my go at it. So just basically, before we go into that, we have to say that J.J. Abrams did not understand what Star Wars is, and that's just basically the short answer. But yeah, let's just not leave it at that. Maybe let's see what Star Wars is then, if this is the whole point. And we have a couple of answers from George Lucas directly. Here we go. Let's listen to this.
Yeah, when I was trying to pitch Star Wars, I had an idea to do this kind of film. I was curious. Just an idea I had about psychological motifs that are in mythology and if they're still accurate today. Because the great thing about mythology is an oral medium up until they learned how to write. But before that, with Homer and everybody, they would just tell the story. They go to people's houses, tell the story, get a free dinner, and that's how they made their livings. And then it passed down from father to son, and it, again, told the people what the rules are. You know, it's the same thing as a church, and all the things we got that make us a community that we all believe in and share is what they use to go from a family to a tribe, and from a tribe to a city, and then to a country. And so I said, I wonder if the people still think the way they thought then. And I think I proved that they do.
Yes. So, what is he talking about mythology? And he's being very generic. And is there something to this? Well, yes, there is. He's specifically talking about oral culture, the origins of language, the structure, the basic structure of narrative before the presence of written language. That's why he talks about Homer. And he's addressing directly some of the issues of oral history, which is very interesting from an anthropological point of view. So his focus is on the narrative techniques, and let's see what he says about the narrative in filmmaking.
Same time, I've been fascinated with the medium, and I've been fascinated with the true nature of the medium, which is very different. It's been used more as a recording medium than as a art form unto itself, and that's where that are sort of they call them tone poems. But in the beginning, like in Russia, this was a whole movement of how do you tell visual stories, basically without dialogue, without all the things that you use to tell a story, and you just use the film itself. It's kind of esoteric. I'm going to try to take it. It hasn't come much further in 100 years. I'm going to try to take it into something that is more emotionally powerful.
Yeah, so what movies? And yes, he's talking about the history of cinema, and the important part there is it hasn't evolved in 100 years. What's he saying? What's he referring to? Well, he's specifically referring to the history of cinema, and if you ever studied a bit of cinema, you've got to go through silent movies, and the reason underlying is that the media of film is specifically tendered towards image. So telling a story through image without words is addressing the true vocation of filmmaking as an art. Now, when he says it hasn't evolved very much from there, it's just addressing this point of what cinema critique says, and the idea that filmmaking should evolve a whole series of arts and techniques to sort of tell its stories. But again, we're seeing how George Lucas is interested in the storytelling part, and that is his focus, and that's why he refers to mythology. But in terms of filmmaking, what his eye sees is a media, an instrument to tell a story, and he wants to bring in the techniques of mythology to make that the basic narrative more involving for the audience. And the way of doing that is, of course, addressing the same issues addressed by mythology. which is the underlying reason why Star Wars is so successful, and we'll get into that further on. But seeing what George Lucas thinks, and we have an extract here of his thoughts of um, the underlying issues mythology addresses, we can see how these are then portrayed within the Star Wars universe, and how it is these things he's talking about. He's talking about daily problems, which of course is what mythology is talking about. Let's just hear this.
What interests you about the conflict between good and evil?
Well, the conflict between good and evil is the basic conflict. The universal question is, am I a good person? I mean, not counting social misfits, of course, or
people like you and me.
yeah. No, I mean,
are you a good person?
I try to be a good person. But of course, that's a very complicated question.
It is.
And it's something you have to ponder because you're doing it every day. You're saying, should I do this or shouldn't I do this? Now, through mythology and things, we're taught certain things that are good and certain things that are bad. But a thinking person questions all that and say, is this really good? Am I really doing the right thing here? Am I really being a kind, compassionate person? Because to me, it's really about a compassionate person as opposed to a person that is consumed with self-interest or a selfish person. Those are the two things.
Mm-hmm.
We all have good and evil in us because we have the selfish side of us and we have the compassionate side of us. The idea is, how do you keep those things in balance? And by keeping those things in balance, you can do a lot of good things. You're never going to get, everybody's human. Everybody's greedy. When you become greedy, then you do bad things to get stuff from other people. Mm-hmm. Once you get that stuff, then you become afraid. Once you become afraid that somebody's going to take it from you, then you start striking out at people, and you get angry at things, you get worried, and that puts you in a whole psychological mindset that turns you ultimately into an evil person.
So yeah, this is about theology and philosophy and the issues that have been always addressed by religion and mythology, basically how to live your daily life at best and within society. But and this brings us to the underlying structure of mythology. But why is this pertinent to Star Wars? Well, it is, and we'll see it later on. But the point is, George Lucas decides that the issue of what mythology addresses is part of that basic important structure that makes a story interesting. So he's saying that you can't tell a story that doesn't have a meaning or doesn't talk to people, because people will just not be interested. But why is this? So mythology, let's look at, like, now we have a page open about Carl Levi Strauss, and he's an anthropologist from the beginning of the 19th century, and he came up with a theory which basically says that society is based or was born on four pillars, and these pillars are religion, sports, rite of passage, and mythology. Without looking too much into them, sports is, well, no, let's start with mythology. Mythology shows the right behavior of the hero, which shows just the audience basically what is the expected behavior in society, or the best behavior in society, or the good example. Then we have religion, which usually goes on the opposite side, showing you what is the bad behavior and what should be avoided within that society. And we have sports that shows the boundaries of the rules and how much you can bend them before being punished, blah blah blah. And eventually we have the rite of passage, which marks the moment in which an individual becomes officially part of society. We've seen this from ancient Sparta, when they throw you in nature and you have to come back to the city, or the coming of age nowadays, finishing high school, getting married, buying a car, any of these which sort of officially make you part of society are a rite of passage. They make you belong to, they make you feel like you belong part, right, as you're part of. So And the way it does this is by talking to you about your daily problems and giving you examples and answers to how to solve your daily problems, which comes to the structure of mythology and how it works. It's important, and we'll see later, because it has a very long history of evolution. But to explain it from my point of view and how I see it, and it's something that then transpasses to religion as religion becomes more pertinent to modern societies during the evolution of society. But mythology works through a system of totems, let's call them totems within the narrative. And the reason this is, and George Lucas speaks of oral history, is because oral tradition is in the very essence of culture, in the anthropological sense, as it's dynamic. It is ever changing. So you can read the Sumerian version of Gilgamesh, you can read the Babylonian version of Gilgamesh, or you can read the Persian version of Gilgamesh, or we can go this by Christian examples. But as far as certain notions within the story are touched during certain points, what I call totems, it doesn't matter that the details are changing. What matters is that the theological, philosophical issue being made, the morale, let's call it, is being addressed throughout the story. So the story can even change throughout the centuries and millennia. It can be Gilgamesh meeting the Chimera in the forest to build the doors for Susa, or it can be Perseus meeting the Gorgon uh, in his quest to save the princess and blah blah blah. But as far as the notion being explained is there, and it teaches something to the society, usually in terms of mutual living. So the rules are always directed towards finding a way to make society work, which is what religion and mythology is. That's why they are the basis of society. But the story is structured in a way that these issues are always addressed, regardless of who's telling the story and how much time has spent. It's sort of significant and important, and the fact that Lucas touches on it is also interesting, because it's sort of a way that this science, this art, let's call it rather, has found to one of the things we talk about oral culture is that you lose information, that you don't know, and that things are lost, and so on, blah blah blah, as opposed to literature and the fact that we've been able to build culture, which has brought us to where we are. But if it's as if oral culture has a fail-safe, and it sort of does in this way. It is the structure of mythology, and it's so down deep rooted within our origins and what we are, that it is hard to ignore how deeply it speaks to us. And it's pertinent and significant to see that now that religion is failing to address some of the issues of secular culture and secular society, mythology is coming back to interest people, and that's just what George Lucas does with Star Wars, bringing to the media of film the narrative structure of mythology. Now, yes, that is the answer. So, um, but let's just dwell a little more into this notion and see how old the notion of mythology actually is and how far back we have to go. And the reason it's relevant is because well, George Lucas didn't just pick any sort of, let's go see what, maybe let's see if Tibetan theater has some important lessons to teach about narrative. Yes, sure, I'm sure it does, and theater in the 60s took some of those lessons, but um, the point is that he's taken the most ancient art in the world by far, and this art has had a substantial period of evolution that transcends any other significant art or science known to man. So just to touch upon it, if we look at the age of civilization, we will look at the cradle of civilization. We're talking about Mesopotamia from 2000 to 2500 BC. Let's even call it 3000 if we want to be easy about this. So we're talking 4,000 years ago. We can stretch this. I mean, in archaeology, nothing is gradual. So before we have civilization and written language, which officially comes with the Babylonians or Sumerians, before that we have the Hindu Valley civilization, which stretches some in modern Pakistan, stretches something to 4000 BC. So we're talking 6,000 years ago, or we can even go to the Hillman civilization, which is something from 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, and we're talking about modern Iran and Afghanistan. Um, but let's not stop at that. Let's even look at what the notion of Neolithic is. We've seen a page earlier on Wikipedia. Neolithic is the last phase of Stonehenge, and it's something between 10 and 15,000 years ago, and it is the phase in which we stopped being totally nomads and we started becoming farmers, and which eventually brought us to have cities. Relevant, not relevant, it's relevant how much all of this took. Well, apart from the notions of settlement, we can say that agriculture is probably one of the most ancient known arts to man, and agriculture stretches pretty far back. We can go up to 20,000 years ago, and we can specifically look about the history of the evolution slash domestication of rice, which is probably the most ancient domesticated crop, or we can look at the palm date, which is also very ancient in its domestication process, but probably a more familiar discussion would come with the grain crop and what's relevant in its evolution. Let's just say that when you plant an undomesticated crop of grain, your yield per fruit is something like 2 to 3 seeds per fruit, or whatever it's called. So basically you're eating one and you're planting two again. Now nowadays one fruit, one thing of grain has something like a yield of 100 to 200, maybe even more seeds. So and this is because we have specifically bred it for thousands and thousands and thousands, and I can keep on saying thousand for 15,000 times, for 15 times, but you get the point. So agriculture is, it can be even more ancient than the same art of agriculture as we intended, in a more evolved state, because we've been doing it as foragers much earlier, and we really had to do it for a long time before those seeds became viable for. And so what I'm saying is that agriculture can be 15, 20,000 years old. So we've been doing it for a long time. Now, if we look at the age of Homo sapiens, and there was a page before on Wikipedia, let's just keep it simple. We are talking something like 100,000 to 200,000 years. That's how long we've been Homo sapiens. And so let's touch about on the notion of language. Not to be confused with the first known languages, so Sanskrit, but the origin of language itself. And this is a very controversial argument. We can see it on Wiki as well, and I'll read a couple of extracts, but it's a controversial argument because, well, there's not much empirical evidence to base these theories on, because you can prove written language if you find texts and some sort of primitive form of writing, but you can't prove that people have been talking unless you find a recording. But just since the 90s, there's been previously it had been considered as an unscientific argument, because it was just, there wasn't any evidence to make any logic discussions on it. Here we go. But since the 90s, anthropologists and archaeologists and linguists have tried to address the issue with a bit more, I don't know, seriousness, let's say. And so we don't have an answer to how long old language is. Why is it pertinent to mythology? It is. We'll get there. Um, let's just see one of the possible theories to this dilemma of the origin of language. The one I like the best is the example of the mother and child, which talks about apes and primates and about us losing our hair when we became Homo sapiens, and this meant that children couldn't hang on to their mothers when they were around foraging for food, which meant they would have to put them down, which meant that the baby cried, which wasn't what we would do when it would hang on the mother with its hair. So the mother had to try and learn to communicate with the child to keep it calm, which of course also helped not being eaten by predators around and blah blah blah, you know. I mean, there's hundreds of other theories. I'm just pointing this because it stresses the fact that many believe, anyway, when we talk about the origins of language, that it is very early in the evolution of Homo sapiens. So if we're talking about 200 to 100,000 years ago, um, we can probably safely say that we've been having language for at least half that time, or most of that time. Let's even say that we've been having it around for 90,000 years, let's just say 100,000, okay? And compared to agriculture, which we've said is at best 20,000, that's a lot of time. It's just basically been, it's like saying that language, and what I mean with language is that it's oral culture, and with oral culture comes mythology, because it's one of the first, it's just basically part of how language can be born as well. So mythology would have been there very, very soon as well, and it would have had a very, very long time to evolve and evolve its techniques. It's basically had as long to evolve as we've had to being Homo sapiens, and which is not true for anything else we've been doing since we've been man, woman, as we intended. So it sort of is pertinent that George Lucas seeks out this technique of narrative to try and find out what are the most underlying interesting issues to all human beings to tell a story, and to find out how you truly tell a story. Because yes, these people have had 100,000 years to sort of, these people we have had, these stories belong to us, and surely there are some good answers in there, just like there are in religious texts and blah blah blah. So going back to J.J. Abrams, just let me have a glass of water. And yes, just to dwelge a little bit more before we finally get there, here are a couple of articles on some of the deeper significance of religious texts, which of course take this notion of what I call totems from mythology to tell stories and to bring more underlying messages. And the difference, the most important difference between religion and mythology is that while mythology works through a series of totems, religion has sort of brought over a better system to advocate the morals or the rules for its chosen type of society. So if we're taking religion as one of the pillars of society, the society it will be in and which it will sort of work towards in building, is defined by an underlying overall message of its religion, which can be seen through all the other smaller messages. And a good, we can see this in Greek mythology, which is very intertwined with Greek religion. So the example there is how Greek mythology, which sort of supports the hero and gives him access to Olympus and the sort of the paradise of gods, is let's start that again, shall we? Let's just say that in Greek mythology, nobody usually goes to heaven. All the people, the normal people, us, we go to Hades, which is hell. And only if you're the hero, you know, you're the worthy one, and you save the princess and kill the dragon and blah blah blah, then you get to go to heaven or something in between where some of the gods are. I don't really know if there's somewhere in between Olympus and Hades, anyways. This is just saying that Greek mythology is cabled towards towards aristocratic society. Only the worthy have access to, only the worthy should, only the worthy, and you can understand it, in the sense of one of the first societies creating a society where the most valuable people, the most valuable contributor got the most, was of course one of the best ways to promote progress, let's say. We can see other example. Christian religion and Jewish religion is seen as being cabled towards more democratic and commercial societies, and more in specific, Protestant culture is very cabled towards the productive society, as producing capitalist society. Or Catholic culture is more cabled towards empathy and is behind many of the ideological and theological reasons of social democrat theory and socialism and blah blah blah. So what I'm getting to say is that the mythology also transferred this notion of a bigger meaning to religion, and religion sort of changed it to give it this underlying sense of meaning to society. So to cabling all its message towards that idea of an idea that sponsors that kind of society. It is in itself a very big totem, let's call it. And so where does this bring us? Well, there's a couple of examples in narrative, so I'm not going to speak about my opinion, and let's just say that in the narrative of the last century, we've had plenty of examples of writers who speak of traditional culture and religious culture having a hard time dealing with secular society. So one of these could be seen as Lovecraft. You might be familiar or not. You say, what's he got to do with, why is he against religion, and why should somebody who talks about giant octopuses in space have any say about that? And well, in the end, his whole works is a critique of an atheist who feels lonely in the senseless universe, and he's just speaking about his issues of living a moral Christian life in an atheist society, and how he's having issues being a good Christian. Now we could have other examples for, you might know or not, John Fante, or who was an American writer talking about the issues of being an Italian Catholic raised kid in America in the 50s. Or we could talk about East is East, a more recent example. And let's not dwelge into that. But we can see how religion is actually having a hard time addressing the issues of science and secular life. Let's just leave it at that. So it is sort of relevant that what Star Wars does when it goes to search the answers in mythology, and the success that it has is probably derived from. And the important thing that George Lucas does in understanding that a story needs to have a message is that he creates a mythology for democratic society. And the underlying point there is that the final hero in Star Wars is democracy, and we all can fight for it, and we can all be part of that story. Just to prove my.
I have brought peace, freedom, justice, and security to my new empire.
Your new empire?
Don't make me kill you.
Anakin, my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy!
Yeah, there you go, there you have it. So, but the point is, Star Wars, in George Lucas's eyes, is a mythology for democratic society, culture, states, call it what you will. But the underlying hero, the point of that it does speak to everybody, and the point, and it starts from hippies in the 60s, and he says this when he talks about New Hope, liberal society. It's that by referring to this society, these values which we want to defend, every one of us is called to be part of that mythos if we want to defend it. It's just like the Spartans had their mythos and their heroes and their mythology, and this is the closest mythos, heroes, that democracy truly has had, because if we look at other issues, and let's just name a few people like Che Guevara, which actually doesn't have much to do with democracy, or Nelson Mandela, which has to do more with human rights, which yes are very related to democracy. We do have heroes of democracy, it's just we don't have a mythos. Aleand, just saying some other names, but this is a very beautiful story, a constructed story, something close to religion and mythology, built with the crucial, essential, exquisite structures of narrative understood and intended since the birth of us as us. And it is no surprise that it did have the success it did. What is surprising is how J.J. Abrams totally fails to fall on this point, even by mistake. There is no underlying message, there is no meaning, there is no significance to whatever he's talking about in The Force Awakens. The interviews with Lucas about him talking about it being something about families and stuff, and saying that Disney dropped that, leaves us with what is the theological meaning of The Force Awakens, and considering that the plot is just basically copy-pasted off A New Hope, there is very little to say in terms of decrypting a message in there, because whatever message was within there was already addressed in another movie, and it's not particularly relevant to modern times. It's not it's not as if it's speaking of science fiction to speak of us, which is what usually science fiction does, by the way. It's just science fiction without meaning, a setting without a meaning, actors for which we don't care. It's all wrong, but apart from that, the real reason for which it is wrong is that it just doesn't have a message per se, which means that just J.J. Abrams totally missed the significance of Star Wars and why it has significance today. And that's just my part on it. Bye. Goodbye, Internet.